Welcome back from Bob Holness, talking to Leonard Bernstein and waiting questions from the audience. Now, who wants to ask the first one? It's always difficult to find someone who will take the plunge. There's a gentleman up on the left.
I admire and respect you a great deal for all the work that you've done, but you mentioned West Side Story. When I hear the name Leonard Bernstein, that is what I think of. What went through your head to produce such excitement and such pleasure?
And how long did it take?
Indeed, how long?
Well, it took a long time. What went through my head was an idea that Jerome Robbins had. He gets the credit for the original idea of doing a New York version of Romeo and Juliet. That goes back as far as 1949. We made an attempt at it and did not succeed and gave it up. Started again in 54, I believe, and by 55, and in 57 we had West Side Story. But the credit goes to, first of all, to Jerome Robbins for having the idea, and another credit goes to him for having the good sense to pick Arthur Lawrence to write the book. Arthur Lawrence is one of the, sometimes forgotten in terms of West Side Story. He wrote one of the greatest and most succinct musical books that have ever appeared on the Broadway stage, maybe on any stage. And I'm honoring him particularly because people forget to talk about him. And he's in London at the moment, where his the show that he didn't write but directed, called La Cage aux Folles, is about to open. It is now, I believe, in preview.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes.
And I wish it very great luck, even though it's opening simultaneously with the opening night of my Mass at Guildhall.
It's a little different.
I don't think we'll have any problem.
Yeah.
And then he had the good sense to pick me, or to ask me, and we all had the good sense to ask Stephen Sondheim. So the four of us, I think, all wanted the same thing. I think we were all, after doing the very best we could to bring a kind of a seriousness of purpose and of method to the Broadway stage, not without humor and not without the other prerequisites of the Broadway stage. But most people said we were crazy, to forget it, that you cannot succeed in writing a Broadway musical in which the first act ends with two dead bodies on the stage, and in which there is so much hatred and violence and hostility. But we persisted. We lost producers, we got another producer. We went through a lot of fire and flame. But in the end, we stuck to our guns, and thank goodness we did.
So say all of us. Well, before we leave West Side Story, I think a question which a lot of people would like to know the answer to. One of the television programs which has attracted more attention almost than any other, apart from the Queen's birthday, was indeed the television program of your rehearsals conducting the record West Side Story.
That's a large statement.
Oh, it received tremendous acclaim in this country. It was repeated and had twice the audience second time round. What's your opinion of the finished product?
Do I dare say God bless the BBC?
By all means. Your opinion of that as a program. Did you mind being shown as you were in that?
Well, I have never seen the finished product.
Oh, haven't you?
I saw only a rough version. And no, I did not mind it because it was instituted and kind of run by somebody I love very much, whose name is Humphrey Burton. And when I say God bless the BBC, I'm also saying God bless Humphrey Burton, who could talk me into anything. He is the most persuasive of men, and he said, "You won't mind if we have a few cameras around during this recording session, will you?" And I said, "Well, as long as you don't shine bright lights, and as long as I don't notice it." And I didn't.
No.
It was very hot. It was August, and we were in the middle of a heat wave, and poor Dame Kiri, I should say, caught a cold from the air conditioner, and we had problems with poor Jose Carreras, who had to be the one character in the whole thing that did not have a Spanish accent, and of course he was the one with the Spanish accent, and poor Jose was trying desperately 24 hours a day to be coached out of this accent, and he was valiant. He really tried so hard. He was marvelous. But of course it shows through. We had some difficulties, but we had such a great cast, and we had such a great chorus and such a great orchestra, yeah, that we seem to have beat all those raps too. And I'm very happy that you all enjoyed the film so much. Marvelous.
From the audience, do you feel you have a lot in common, discounting the lapse of time, between George Gershwin? Do you feel you were an extension of his talents and he could have gone on to generate yours?
Not specifically. I adored George Gershwin, and I was terribly upset when I heard the news of his death. I was then in my teens, and I think I knew every note he had ever written. I could play and sing Of Thee I Sing, for example, by heart, and Porgy and Bess. But I don't consider myself an extension of him, particularly. I consider myself an extension of all the music I've ever heard and loved, which includes George Gershwin. It also includes Schubert and the Beatles and Bach and a few other people. I extend to the extent of my powers whatever I can within the field of music. But I don't consider myself an apostle of any sort or a specific extension of any one other composer.
I wasn't trying to suggest that you were the George Gershwin that would have been. I'm rather considering yourself, you describe yourself as a musician. George Gershwin had this wider range that really, I can't think of any composers in this century, certainly, that were writing for shows one moment and then becoming very serious with concerto and symphony or whatever in that short space of time. Was he really the first of his kind in America? Sort of the New World type music, and were you continuing from there? Not were you trying to repeat what he was doing, but did that have an effect on the actual continent, the music of that continent?
Well, I suppose it did have its effect. I still have to answer no. In spite of my adoration of this man and the tragic and untimely curtailment of his activity, he could have gone on to do Lord knows what. But you see, George Gershwin was essentially a songwriter, and a Tin Pan Alley songwriter who little by little learned more and more about writing more extended pieces and more, quote, serious music. Given the chance, heaven only knows what he might have written. But I don't feel that it's fallen to my lot to pick up at the point where he left off and go on. Whatever influences he has had on me are, I hope, for the good, but I hope that there's a personal voice in me that speaks out and is not simply regurgitating what Gershwin wrote or might have written had he lived.
Thank you. Any more questions? I'm sorry to get you to run. There's one in the middle down here.
Bernstein, you spent a lot of time attempting to explain music to the public in general, particularly young people, and you've written very erudite books on understanding music and so on. To what extent do you think music can be explained in words?
It's very hard to do. You can do it in words if you have an orchestra and a piano to illustrate every few sentences, or you must have that musical illustration constantly. You can't just talk about it. And that's why most of my books are developments of television scripts or lectures that I've given at Harvard, for example. Or they do involve musical example all the time. If someone says to me, can you explain this Chopin nocturne to me? Why am I so moved by it? I have to say, well, I could explain this aspect of it or this aspect of this, but I cannot explain the phenomenon of its existence. That is too mysterious and partakes of the divine. And besides, if one could describe the Chopin nocturne, he wouldn't have had to have written it. We could just talk about it.
This doesn't only affect so-called serious music, it affects jazz
and
as well.
This also has something to do with your Gershwin question over there, because one of the answers to your question is that I am not just a songwriter or even just a composer. I do that too, and I teach wherever I can, and I conduct, and I do many more aspects of music than George Gershwin did. Therefore, I can't think of myself as an extension of only that. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? Yes.
What I was going to say is I have a record at home which goes back to the 50s called What is Jazz? And you in fact do what this gentleman was talking about. You talk about music, but jazz music and its roots with the assistance of musical instruments. And that's an amazing record. Did you have
thank you.
A true love of jazz at that time? Was it something?
I've always had a true love of jazz. I mean, it paid for my piano lessons.
Yes, but you don't revert to it that often, do you? Not now. Apart from one or two pieces.
Revert to it? You mean in my own music?
In your repertoire, yeah.
Well, it's not a matter of reverting to it in an overt way. But look, this is jazzy. Or I am now writing jazz music. It has permeated the music I write on a much deeper level than the superficial one of being jazzy music. It's in the very fiber of what I write, I think, no matter what the piece is. I mean, there is a fugue in West Side Story, which is danced, called Cool, which is a 12-tone fugue, and very strictly worked out, and Schoenbergian principles and all the rest of it. But I suppose it couldn't have been written by anybody but an American composer with a jazz background. But it's not jazz in and of itself. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. Another question, please. There are a couple.
Mr. Bernstein, just to carry on from the earlier question, many people think that music's being neglected from general education at the moment. How crucial do you think it is to the learning process?
How
crucial do you think it is to the general learning process?
Well, I am among those who deplore the absence of music in education, not because I'm a musician and I want to see it spread. That's, of course, one reason. But because I think that, along with Plato and Socrates, that music is an integral and basic and crucial and critical part of education in general. Plato tells us that he thought it was the basic thing that a young person had to learn. And in fact, he thought it was so important it could be dangerous if wrongly taught. You see, the study of music teaches us much more than the specific aspects of music. It teaches us about balance and form. It teaches us about creativity, and it teaches us about group participation. It teaches us about harmony in many senses. And I think it's terribly important for the arts in general to have a greater place in the educational world than they do, but music in particular. So I couldn't agree with you more. And from a very early age.
Do you think you'll ever write another musical?
You mean, will I ever be lured back to commercial Broadway? Well, if the circumstances are right, I suppose I could be seduced, but at the moment my thoughts run more along operatic lines, since one doesn't have to deal with the billion-dollar producers.
Did you meet, at the time that you had all this amazing commercial success with West Side Story, did you meet a resentment from your more serious colleagues in the business? And do you still come across part of that?
No. How's that for a short answer?
That's very good. Very good. Never?
I tell you, what does occur to me as you ask that is I do wish somebody would ask something about something other than West Side Story.
Well, yes, quite. But it's proved its point, hasn't it? The fact that the questions have been mainly around your commercial life means that people do associate you with that side. Does this disappoint you when you are striving to be recognized in the more serious side rather more than the commercial side these days?
I wouldn't say I was striving to be
I don't
recognized.
Mean you know what I mean.
I remember I told you I was humbled back in my 20s.
That's right.
And I have faith in the credo that there are no accidents, and if something is going to succeed, it will succeed. This does not preclude hard work and lots of sweat. But when we strove, to pick up your word, to make West Side Story work, it was against all the odds you can imagine. It was impossible. There had never been such a work before. It could have failed miserably. It so happened that it didn't. I have since written things which have failed miserably, and which shouldn't have, I think. I spent the better part of 3 years writing a show to celebrate the 200th birthday of my country in 76, with Alan J. Lerner, which opened, it should not have opened, but did, in New York, and ran 4 days and was a miserable disaster. That's 3 years of one's life. I could name you a few others that never even got as far as the stage or even the rehearsal room, on which I labored for years. So it's not a big commercial success story at all. But those things which seem to be destined to succeed seem to succeed. And I accept that. I work as hard as I can to make them good, and that's all I can do.
Let's round off on the festival. We've hardly mentioned the festival itself, apart from a mention right at the beginning. I want to just ask you a question about the Sunday concert, which is the Airborne Symphony by Mark Blitzstein. Now, Mark Blitzstein...
Half of it is.
Yes, part of it. Mark Blitzstein has a special niche in your existence, in your heart, actually, doesn't he? He was over here during the war, a member of the 8th Air Force.
And he wrote the Airborne Symphony here.
For Britain.
And finished it in the States. And ironically enough, it's never been performed here. This will be the first performance in England. Mark Blitzstein was a very close friend of mine and had a lot of influence on what I did. I think he understood better than any American composer the marriage of popular elements, or whatever you want to call them, and serious elements in music, which he exhibited beautifully in pieces of his that aren't well enough known. For example, his opera Regina is not known here. Cradle Will Rock, which you mentioned before when we were chatting.
It was staged here just recently.
No for an Answer, and so on. These are not known works, but they have had tremendous influence on me and on many others, and through me on younger composers who tried to combine these apparently unmarriageable elements. He died tragically too young, also like Gershwin, was cut off in his prime in 1964, in the midst of writing what I think would have been his great opera. But I miss him sorely, and I'm very glad that finally the Airborne, of which I gave the world premiere back in the 40s, the late 40s, is finally going to be heard here. And I know that my young disciple, John Mauceri, of whom I'm very proud and who's going to conduct it, will give a performance of which I will be proud and of which Mark would have been proud.
Let's finish on you. You've won or been awarded 10 Emmys, 10 Grammys, and an award for lifetime achievement. Is there anything else you want to achieve? Is there something that you want to achieve to round it off?
All I want to achieve is some years in which to write the works I have yet to write. And if the good Lord will just give me some more years. I mean, I am approaching the biblical limit.
70.
Oh, 70 is just around the corner, and I can't believe it, but there it is. I've been around an awful long time. And so I'm just praying for the years and the energy to do the works that have yet to be done, and which will perhaps make the contribution that I ultimately want to make to, not just to art or to world music, but to people, because that's why I write music, and that's why I conduct music, and that's why I do anything I do. It's because I love people, and I find that music is the best and deepest level of communication with people. And so that's why I pray for time.
And if you can spend even a little of that time with us here in this country, you'll always be welcome. Leonard Bernstein, thank you very much.
Thank you.